Thank you. Sometimes I just don't know what I'd do without you. By 10 the following morning, Cleo was still lounging around in her robe and pajamas. She had no real desire to do much. She felt flat. She'd spent the better part of the morning hugging the toilet bowl, vomiting, and now she felt completely wrung out. Her stomach still uncertain, she gingerly padded to the sleeper couch that Cal had, for once, made up before traipsing off to parts unknown earlier that morning. He always disappeared for hours on end doing God knows what, God knows where. Cleo had been relieved to see the back of him that morning because his relentless and oblivious good cheer was driving her up the wall. She was thinking about attempting to eat some food when a knock sounded on the front door. She frowned, not used to being here during the day and not at all sure who it could be. They had an intercom security system, so knocks at the door without advance warning were extremely rare. The knock sounded again, and she pushed herself up from the couch. She paused for an instant to get the nausea under control, before making her way to the front door. There was no peephole, so she'd have to go the other route. Who's there? She called through the door. There was a long moment of silence during which she wondered if the person had moved on to a different apartment. Me. The voice, only slightly muffled by the thin wood of the door, was instantly recognizable, and Cleo froze. When she didn't respond for a full minute, the knock sounded again, loud and authoritative and so damned like him she wondered how she hadn't guessed who it was from the sound of the knock alone. "It's me, Damaso," he growled. "Open the damned door." "No, what?" She could practically feel his incredulity through the wood. "I said no. Go away. We'll not leave until we have settled this matter." He sounded pretty adamant, and she chewed on her lip indecisively. "I didn't think there was anything to settle." "You've made your mind up." "I refuse to discuss this through the door. If you do not open it, I will kick it down. I don't imagine it will take too much effort, the wood is so thin." "We can't all have fancy walnut oak doors," she said with a sneer, and he was right. The wood was pretty thin if she could hear him sigh through the door. "I will count to 3. If you do not open the door, I will." She clicked her tongue irritably and snatched open the door. Only after she stood facing him in his bespoke-suited splendor did she remember that she wore fleecy, polka-dot pajamas with a fuzzy pink robe and pink and white bunny slippers. Her hair was a mess, and she probably looked pretty washed out after that morning's puking session. And the way he stared at her told her everything she needed to know about how truly awful she looked. "Your hair." She stared at him in complete bewilderment. Why would her hair be the first thing he noticed about her? And then she remembered. She reached up a trembling hand to run a hand through her short, sleek bob, trying to recall if the pink she and Cal had applied to the bleached tips of her hair the night before was particularly vivid. "I figured I didn't have to look like a corporate drone anymore," she said, shrugging slightly. "It's pink. Only the tips." He finally dragged his horrified gaze from her hair down the rest of her body. "Did I disturb your sleep?" he asked. Looking truly confused. "I didn't see the need to get dressed when I don't have a job to get ready for." "And you did not consider going out to look for a new job?" Geez, rich people really had no clue how the real world worked. He sounded way too judgmental for her liking, and she bristled defensively. "I just got fired from my previous position yesterday. I haven't had time to sit down with the classifieds to job hunt yet." He nodded and shoved his hands into his coat pockets as his gaze roamed around the small, slightly dingy, and far from tidy interior of her apartment. "This place has lousy security. A student type in baggy jeans and a Rastafarian cap simply let me in. Held the door open and waved me through." "Oh. I think he might have been on something," he said, voice ripe with disapproval. "If it's who I'm thinking of, then he was very definitely on something." Young Isaac from down the hall was always high. Cleo didn't know how he managed to get any studying done. Dante's brow furrowed in response to her words. "And you feel safe in this dump? Why are you here?" she asked, refusing to answer any more of his questions. "May I sit?" After a brief hesitation, she nodded. He glanced around the room again before heading toward the kitchen table and turning to wait for her there. Once she joined him, he dragged out a chair, ushered her into it, and took his own seat. A little flustered by the gentlemanly gesture, she waited for him to speak. But he didn't say anything for a long time and merely stared at his loosely folded hands resting on the table in front of him. She shifted uncomfortably before he lifted his eyes and trapped her with that intense gaze of his. She froze beneath that stare, feeling like a butterfly pinned to a board. "You're pregnant." "I know. How far along are you now?" he asked. She couldn't help it, she allowed her hand to drop to her abdomen, still in awe that there was a life in there. 12 weeks, she whispered. This week her eyelids started to grow in properly. "Her?" he asked gruffly, and she shook herself out of her reverie to focus on him again. "The baby's a she this week." "Last week, a he." Last week was exciting. She, or he, started making fists. Can you imagine this little life, barely the size of a prune, with tiny hands that can make fists? Can you feel it doing all that? Making fists and stuff? He sounded fascinated despite himself. "No, I can't. I've been reading this week-by-week pregnancy book. It's really good." There was another long, awkward silence as Cleo tried to figure out if she could say or do anything to convince him to leave. "I wish I had security guards too," she said wistfully, and he glanced up at her in surprise. "So that you can kick me out?" He sounded amused rather than offended. "I want you to leave," she admitted. "I don't like having you here in my home. I came to tell you that I agree to your terms. I've signed your documents. If I am the father of that baby, I will pay an amount toward its support. You won't try to take her from me?" Cleo verbalized her worst fear on a whisper. "No. Your baby doesn't interest me. You don't interest me. I want you both out of my life as quickly and quietly as possible." Well, she'd always known that was how he would feel, but the rejection still stung. She felt the pain more for her baby than she did for herself. She'd known the stakes going into this thing with Dante Damaso, but the baby was an innocent in all of this, and now would never have a father to love her and protect her. Still, he was cold and ruthless and would undoubtedly make a lousy father. She'd grown up without a dad, and while she was a mess at times, she'd turned out mostly all right. Luke barely remembered their father either. The man had stuck around for 5 years and had skipped out on his family less than a month after Cleo's birth. Their mother, never the most stable of creatures, had gone on a downward spiral after that, and 5 years later had dumped her children with their grandparents and swanned off to Asia. None of them had seen or heard from her again, and Luke and Cleo had received word of her death soon after their grandparents had passed. Luke flew to Nepal, where she died, and took care of the funeral arrangements. He returned with a few boxes of her personal items, and that had been that. A sad and lonely ending to a sad and lonely life. "Why didn't you send your attorney to take care of the matter?" she asked. "Dante. You didn't have to come in person. I wanted to make it perfectly clear that this is all there will ever be between us, just a financial agreement benefiting the child should it happen to be mine." "Got it," she murmured, as if she needed that obvious fact spelled out to her, "and I wanted to add that perhaps I was a little hasty in firing you." "Hasty? Try unfair," she corrected. "And harsh. You treated me like a criminal. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to be escorted out by your thugs? I didn't get to say goodbye to anybody, and I heard rumors that maybe I'd been caught stealing." He looked uncomfortable and his broad shoulders shifted restlessly. "It was not my intention to humiliate you." His words infuriated her and opened her eyes to the fact that she was a lot angrier about the embarrassing experience than she realized. "Is that an apology? Because if it is, it needs work." "Look, this is not getting us anywhere," he deflected. "I would like to offer you another position." "Back in HR?" she asked, allowing the subject change. For now, no, there would be too many uncomfortable questions. "I want to move you to the Joburg office." Oh, he wanted to move her to an unfamiliar office, in a strange city miles away from her family and friends, did he? And far, far away from him. Wouldn't that just make his life a whole lot easier? Not that Cleo was interested in making it difficult. She just wanted to move on with her own life and forget she even knew Dante Damaso. I can't move to Johannesburg, she stated, her voice brooking no argument. Look, be reasonable. You can hardly raise a kid without some form of employment to bolster the financial aid you'll be receiving from me. You be reasonable. If I take you up on this offer, I may have the benefit of an added income, but I won't have the emotional support I would need from my family and friends. This is my first pregnancy, I'll be going it solo, and I'll want my brother Blue, and my other close friends around. I'll want familiar surroundings. The last thing I want or need right now is to move to an unfamiliar city. He was quiet for a long time before conceding the point with a very brief dip of his jaw. Give me time and I'll try to arrange something else, he said. I don't need any favors from you, Mr. Damaso. He looked almost embarrassed by the honorific he had insisted she use just the day before. Just child support. You are in no way responsible for any other part of my life. Nonetheless, I am the reason you no longer have a job. I acted hastily and would like to make amends for that. A glowing reference would do just fine, thank you, she said, while the inner voice that had tried to warn her on that first night in Tokyo protested again. As before, she didn't listen to it, and Cleo hoped she wouldn't wind up, once again, paying for her refusal to heed her common sense. But she had some pride, and depending on him for child support was bad enough. She didn't want to depend on him for her very livelihood too, not after he had so unceremoniously fired her the day before. Yet another thing, she noted, that he had not yet apologized for. So how does this paternity test thing work? He changed the subject rather abruptly and looked remarkably uncomfortable with his own question. Well, you're the one who wants proof that the baby is yours. So you're going to have to arrange for that. They have prenatal tests, right? I will accept only non-invasive testing. Anything else could potentially harm my baby. He grunted, a sound she assumed meant assent. And you're paying for it. I'm not paying for some stupid test I already know the answer to. I have to protect myself, he said almost defensively. You're not the first woman to ever accuse me of fathering her baby. Oh God, you mean you have other illegitimate kids running around out there? Of course not. Those other women weren't even pregnant. He looked so disgusted that Cleo almost felt sorry for him. It couldn't be easy to be the target of so many gold diggers. No wonder he had them all sign non-disclosure agreements. Then again, how many good, decent women had he scared off with that stupid document? His personal life was crazy and a little messed up, and she was happy enough to stay well away from it. Maybe you should consider limiting yourself to, I don't know, 1 or 2 serious relationships a year, with nicer women. You may find life a lot easier in the long run. The thing with you wasn't a relationship and it wasn't, she held up a hand to shut him up. Surprisingly enough it worked, spare me. I've heard it all before. Blah blah, you're not my usual type blah blah, it wasn't serious blah blah blah. You're like a broken record, Mr. Damaso. It gets tedious after a while. Now would you please mind leaving me alone? I have stuff to do. For God's sake, call me Dante, he commanded, and she sighed before crossing her arms over her chest. I prefer Mr. Damaso. It keeps things businesslike and impersonal. Besides, I hope never to see you again after this, so does it matter what I call you? I suppose not. He levered himself up from the table and stood towering above her for a few long moments before she scrambled to her feet to feel less small. The hasty movement immediately sent her stomach into turmoil, and she clapped a hand over her mouth and pushed past him to the bathroom, where she was violently ill. When she eventually came back to her miserable senses, it was to find Dante Damaso on his haunches beside where she was hunched wretchedly over the commode, one of his large hands stroking her back soothingly. Appalled that he had seen her like that, she shrugged off his touch and moved away from him shakily, ignoring him when he reached down to help her stand. He allowed her that small, defiant move and stood back and watched while she splashed water on her face, soaking the front of her robe in the process, and gargled some mouthwash. She pretended he wasn't there and exited the bathroom to return to the living room with her spine straight and her chin up. "Maybe you should lie down or something," he suggested. And she swallowed down her irritation as she glanced over her shoulder to find him watching her from the bathroom door. "Why are you still here?" She trudged the short distance to her room, shrugged out of her wet robe, and hung it from a hook on her wall to dry. Unfortunately, he followed her. Could the man not take a hint? He shoved his hands into his trouser pockets and glanced around her bedroom, taking in the clothes that were draped over every surface, the posters of ballet and contemporary dancers that adorned her beige walls, and the ragged point shoes that were hanging from one of the posts of her gorgeous, antique, queen-size four-poster bed. She loved that bed, had brought it with her from her old bedroom in the house when she moved out. It cost the earth to transport it every time she moved, but she would never sell it or leave it behind. "I can't figure out if this room is a teen dream or nightmare," he mused, and leveled that killer gaze on her again. "A bit juvenile, isn't it? Do you plan to move out of this dump before you have the baby?" "None of your damned business." "Please leave," she demanded wearily. He sighed impatiently and turned to walk the short distance to her bedroom door. "Mike Grayson, my attorney, will be in touch." He threw the words over his shoulder as he reached for the front door. She trailed him back into the living room and was startled when he unexpectedly turned around again to look at her. "Eat something. You look like hell." And with that parting shot, he was gone, leaving Cleo feeling absolutely drained in his wake. Her legs turned to liquid as she finally allowed herself to relax, and she sank down onto the sleeper couch. The door opened again seconds later and surprised the hell out of her. She jumped, instantly back on alert, when his head popped through the opening and locked the damned door. He ordered before leaving again. She stared at the closed door in complete disbelief, before forcing herself up to do just as he'd commanded. More as a deterrent against any more unwelcome visits from him than out of any real fear of an intruder. Chapter 7, 10 days and one simple cheek swab later, Dante sat in his office and stared at the discreet, still closed envelope he held in his hands. He knew what it would say. He'd known since that first meeting with Mike. A mercenary woman would have demanded far more from him than Cleo had. "It doesn't matter," he said aloud. And it didn't. It couldn't. This kid wouldn't be his in any way except biologically, and he could live with that. He could quite happily live with that. Why should he sacrifice his freedom for what amounted to a stupid mistake? Cleo chose to keep the baby, and Dante chose not to know the child. They could both live with that, and someday, when it was old enough, the kid would have to live with that too. He would have to live with the knowledge that his father had chosen not to know him or love him. Dante noticed, almost impassively, that his hands had started to shake, and he dropped the envelope onto his desk and clenched his fists to control the tremble. He picked it up again seconds later, took in a huge gulp of air, and tore it open, the violence of the gesture akin to ripping a band-aid off a wound. He unfolded the slip of paper carefully, reading through the scientific jargon before getting to the most relevant bit. "Cannot be excluded as the father of the child, probability of paternity 99.9992%. Right." He refolded the paper precisely along the original lines and noted that his hands were trembling again. He meticulously placed it back into its envelope and then smoothed it carefully flat on the desk surface before tucking it away into the breast pocket of his jacket. Once there, it felt like it was burning a hole into his chest, so he removed it again and shoved it into his desk drawer. He locked the drawer and tucked the key into his breast pocket. He had anticipated this, he had known it was coming, so now he could continue with his life as planned. This matter was already taken care of. Mike had only been waiting for confirmation of the child's paternity before he made the financial arrangements. It was out of Dante's hands now. He could get back to business. He could build more hotels, go out with gorgeous, glamorous women, and one day, years from now, even marry one of them. That woman would be the mother of his children. Simple and uncomplicated, that's how he liked his life. And the woman he chose to be his wife would have to be equally simple and uncomplicated. Someone who could make his life easier without needing constant attention and validation. Cleo and the baby were just obstacles to overcome before he could get back out onto the open, uncomplicated road of his life again. He need never think of them again, only, he couldn't help but recall the last time he'd seen Cleo, and he wondered if she'd found another job. And if she'd moved into a better, more secure apartment yet. Were the tips of her glossy black hair still that horrendous shade of pink? Did she still suffer from morning sickness? What wonders did week 14 hold? Mierda, he had to stop thinking about this. He picked up his phone and thumbed through his contacts before finding the name he was searching for. Nikki, Querida, this is Dante. Do you want to meet for a drink later? He was going to get this situation out of his mind in a time-honored tradition. With booze, babes, and lots of sex, Cleo read the test results, laughed, then cried a little and laughed again before tearing the paper up and tossing the pieces in the bin. She would probably hear from Grantley Bingham, her grandparents' really ancient attorney, soon. Mr. Bingham had kindly offered to help her out for a fraction of his usual fee because he felt he owed it to her grandparents. He'd been dealing directly with Dante's attorney and had informed her that things were going along swimmingly at the moment. The old man was sweet, and despite knowing her for her entire life, had remained completely non-judgmental and professional throughout their proceedings. He had merely congratulated her on her pregnancy and kept giving her unwanted advice on everything from morning sickness to baby names. Cleo rested a hand on the still flat surface of her abdomen. She still suffered from morning sickness. But luckily it wasn't too debilitating anymore. Even though her book told her that her energy should be returning, she continued to feel lethargic, which she put down to a mild case of depression. She didn't have a job yet, and once she started showing it would be even more difficult to find anything. Luke and Blue had been pressing her to move in with them, and it was becoming the likeliest scenario for her. Luke had been seriously pissed off with her when she'd told him that she'd quit her job, and he'd put it down to Cleo being her usual irresponsible self. Cleo had said and done nothing to correct him. Cleo was scared and felt alone and lonely, despite Cal's constant and overbearing presence and Luke and Blue's smothering. Most nights she woke up in an absolute panic, with cold sweat dripping down her body, terrified of screwing up her baby's life, and she had absolutely no one to talk to about that. She had her first dating ultrasound coming up in a couple of days and hadn't even told Blue about it. The appointment was for midday, and she didn't want Blue to take off any more time from work to go with her. Luke managed a small IT company in a rundown industrial part of town, and the place always seemed to fall completely apart when he wasn't there. She could take Cal, but quite frankly, she'd rather go alone. He tended to irritate her when she felt even remotely stressed. She looked around her flat and sighed. She'd been cooped up in here for too long. She hadn't ventured out much due to a lack of funds and a lack of desire to do anything remotely social. But she was unaccustomed to going so long without any form of exercise, and it was starting to give her a dose of cabin fever. She resolutely went about collecting her leotard, a gauzy crepe wrap skirt, tights, and point shoes and stuffed them into a tote bag. She tied her short hair up into a small, tight ponytail and grabbed up her coat on her way out the door. It was mid-spring, but the air still had a bite, and it had been an unseasonably rainy October. A fine, misty rain fell outside, and as she walked the short distance to her favorite dance studio, the light precipitation frizzed her hair and dampened her face. The air smelled clean and she inhaled deeply. She would have to pay for her entry into the studio, and she couldn't really afford to spend the money, but she really needed this.